look about them that made you wonder at their depth, and look again. The increase of dignity in her face had been imparted to her form. I do not know if she had grown taller since the birth of her child, but she looked as if she had; and although she had lived in a very humble home, yet there was something about either it or her, or the people amongst whom she had been thrown during the last few years, which had so changed her, that whereas 6 or 7 years ago you would have perceived that she was not altogether a lady by birth and education, yet now she might have been placed among the highest in the land, and would have been taken by the most critical judge for their equal, although ignorant of their conventional etiquette, an ignorance which she would have acknowledged in a simple childlike way, being unconscious of any false shame. Her whole heart was in her boy. She often feared that she loved him too much, more than God himself, yet she could not bear to pray to have her love for her child lessened; but she would kneel down by his little bed at night, at the deep, still midnight, with the stars that kept watch over Rizpah shining down upon her, and tell God what I have now told you, that she feared and loved her child too much, yet could not, would not, love him less, and speak to him of her one treasure as she could speak to no earthly friend. And so, unconsciously, her love of her child led her up to love to God, to the All-knowing, who read her heart. It might be superstition, I dare say it was, but somehow she never lay down to rest without saying, as she looked her last on her boy, "Thy will, not mine, be done." And even while she trembled and shrank with infinite dread from sounding the depths of what that will might be, she felt as if her treasure were more secure to waken up rosy and bright in the morning, as one over whose slumbers God's holy angels had watched, for the very words which she had turned away in sick terror from realising the night before. Her daily absence at her duties to the Bradshaw children only ministered to her love for Leonard. Everything does minister to love, when its foundation lies deep in a true heart, and it was with exquisite pang of delight that, after a moment of vague fear, "Oh, mercy to myself," I said, "if Lucy should be dead!" she saw her child's bright face of welcome as he threw open the door every afternoon on her return home. For it was his silently appointed work to listen for her knock, and rush breathless to let her in. If he were in the garden, or upstairs among the treasures of the lumber room, either Miss Benson, or her brother, or Sally would fetch him to his happy little task. No one so sacred as he to the allotted duty. And the joyous meeting was not deadened by custom to either mother or child. Ruth gave the Bradshaws the highest satisfaction, as Mr Bradshaw often said both to her and to the Bensons. Indeed, she rather winced under his pompous approbation. But his favourite recreation was patronising; and when Ruth saw how quietly and meekly Mr Benson submitted to gifts and praise, when an honest word of affection, or a tacit, implied acknowledgment of equality, would have been worth everything said and done, she tried to be more meek in spirit, and to recognise the good that undoubtedly existed in Mr Bradshaw. He was richer and more prosperous than ever; a keen, far-seeing man of business, with an undisguised contempt for all who failed in the success which he had achieved. But it was not alone those who were less fortunate in obtaining wealth than himself that he visited with severity of judgment. Every moral error or delinquency came under his unsparing comment. Stained by no vice himself, either in his own eyes or in that of any human being who cared to judge him, having nicely and wisely proportioned and adapted his means to his ends, he could afford to speak and act with a severity which was almost sanctimonious in its ostentation or thankfulness as to himself. Not a misfortune or a sin was brought to light, but Mr Bradshaw could trace to its cause in some former mode of action, which he long ago foretold would lead to shame. If another's son turned out wild or bad, Mr Bradshaw had little sympathy. It might have been prevented by a stricter rule, or more religious life at home. Young Richard Bradshaw was quiet and steady, and other fathers might have had sons like him if they had taken the same pains to enforce obedience. Richard was an only son, and yet Mr Bradshaw might venture to say he had never had his own way in his life. Mrs Bradshaw was, he confessed. Mr Bradshaw did not like confessing his wife's errors. Rather less firm than he should have liked with the girls, and with some people, he believed. Jemima was rather headstrong, but to his wishes she had always shown herself obedient. All children were obedient if their parents were decided and authoritative, and every one would turn out well, if properly managed. If they did not prove good, then they might take the consequences of their errors. Mrs Bradshaw murmured faintly at her husband when his back was turned, but if his voice was heard, or his footsteps sounded in the distance, she was mute, and hurried her children into the attitude or action most pleasing to their father. Jemima, it is true, rebelled against this manner of proceeding, which savoured to her a little of deceit; but even she had not, as yet, overcome her awe of her father sufficiently to act independently of him, and according to her own sense of right, or rather, I should say, according to her own warm, passionate impulses. Before him, the wilfulness which made her dark eyes blaze out at times was hushed and still. He had no idea of her self-tormenting, no notion of the almost southern jealousy which seemed to belong to her brunette complexion. Jemima was not pretty. The flatness and shortness of her face made her almost plain. Yet most people looked twice at her expressive countenance, at the eyes which flamed or melted at every trifle, at the rich colour which came at every expressed emotion into her usually sallow face, at the faultless teeth which made her smile like a sunbeam. But then, again, when she thought she was not kindly treated, when a suspicion crossed her mind, or when she was angry with herself, her lips were tight pressed together, her colour was wan and almost livid, and a stormy gloom clouded her eyes as with a film. But before her father her words were few, and he did not notice looks or tones. Her brother Richard had been equally silent before his father in boyhood and early youth; but since he had gone to be a clerk in a London house, preparatory to assuming his place as junior partner in Mr Bradshaw's business, he spoke more on his occasional visits at home; and very proper and highly moral was his conversation, sentences of goodness, which were like the flowers that children stick in the ground, and that have not sprung upwards from roots, deep down in the hidden life and experience of the heart. He was as severe a judge as his father of other people's conduct, but you felt that Mr Bradshaw was sincere in his condemnation of all outward error and vice, and that he would try himself by the same laws as he tried others. Somehow Richard's words were frequently heard with a lurking distrust, and many shook their heads over the patterned son. But then it was those whose sons had gone astray, and had been condemned in no private or tender manner by Mr Bradshaw, so it might be revenge in them. Still, Jemima felt that all was not right. Her heart sympathised in the rebellion against his father's commands which her brother had confessed.